The story of Esther is one that has intrigued the world for almost 2,500 years now. It's filled with drama and sex and violence and revenge and nail-biting moments of tension. It's the story of a powerful king who falls desperately in love with a peasant girl who becomes queen while hiding this dark secret that will end up getting her killed by an ancient enemy of her people, which we'll get into a little bit later on tonight. This little book, one of only 2 books in the entire Bible that never mentions God, it doesn't really ever tell us what God's thinking about. It doesn't tell us what God is doing or how God is reacting to what's going on, even behind the scenes. And honestly, that's kind of one of the reasons that it makes me love this book. It makes me like it even more because it kind of feels more like my life than any of the other books in the Bible. Not because I'm a beautiful young girl who will one day become queen, but because the people in this story, they don't really know what's going on. They don't really know what's going to happen next. They don't know what God's overall plan is, and they certainly don't know that everything is going to turn out okay. One of the things that's cool about this book is that, unlike most of the other books in the Bible, the author never really fills us in on what God is doing. We get to sit right next to the characters on this roller coaster as it rockets down the tracks, and we experience all of the highs and the lows that they do, and it's not always a fun ride. In fact, there's a lot of fear in this book. Fear about the future, fear about the people who are in power, and fear because of the reality that nobody is fully in control of their own story. There's a lot of fear, but there's also some inspiringly strong faith. Faith that even though they don't hold ultimate control over their own lives, Esther and Mordecai know that they have a role to play in this story of God. They know that things may go terribly wrong, and there's an acknowledgement that even if that happens, even if they're killed, they're still going to do what's right. They're still going to try and save the lives of their people. Now, honestly, they know that they can't do everything, that they're not fully in charge, but they can do something. And while this is a story of inspirational faith and impressive bravery, it's not a story of perfect people. It's not a story that tells you, go and do likewise, right? In fact, when most people finish reading this story for the first time, they wish that it would have ended differently. Because it's hard to watch the heroes of your story turn into bloodthirsty butcherers. But we're not quite there yet. Because when we last left the story of Esther last week, Hadassah, who was going by her non-Jewish name, Esther, she had just won the king's heart in this empire-wide beauty contest of sorts, I guess. And she had just been crowned queen of the Persian Empire. This is the point where the line, "and everybody lived happily ever after," would be perfect, right? Just in the story right here, and everything is awesome. But as we all know from every single story we've ever been told, there has to be a bad guy. So, if you have your Bibles with you, now is the time to open them up to Esther chapter 3, where we are going to be introduced to the villain of this story. His name's Haman. He's a noble who gets promoted over all of the other nobles in the empire, and because of this promotion to this position of power and influence, the custom of the empire, and because of the decree of the king, everybody is required to bow down to Haman out of respect. But Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, who's working as a guard at the royal palace, he refuses to bow down to Haman. Now, Haman seems to be the type of guy who loved this new position of power, not because of what he could do to make the lives of the common people better, but because it made him rich. It made him powerful, which obviously feeds his ego, right? And when he hears from the other palace guards that Mordecai was refusing to comply with the orders of the king for him to bow down, to respect him, Not just because Mordecai was being a turd, but because he was a Jew. It sparked something in Haman that doesn't seem to make much sense to the modern reader. Now, frankly, it's kind of a weird turn of events, but Haman decides that instead of dealing with Mordecai's insolence by just punishing Mordecai, which seems to be like the normal thing you would do, Haman decides that he's going to create an elaborate plan to murder every single Jew in the entire kingdom of Persia in this well-coordinated genocide, which, if we're being honest, is a bit of a overreaction. But in fact, this seems like such an overblown offense that the story loses some of its believability if you're reading it for the first time. Like, what in the world? Like, genocide because this guy is dissing on you? I mean, where does this extreme reaction come from? Is it this obvious tell that this story is just a parable that's being told to the Jewish people over centuries? Or is there something deeper that we're missing when we read it casually or we watch one of the many movies that's been made about this book? One of the clues to why Haman's plan makes a little bit more sense, right? Why his apparent villainy is this quick mention in the first paragraph of chapter 3. It's just a single word. But like most odd words that we encounter in the Bible, this one is easily skipped over when we read it. But it holds some interesting background info that helps us to make sense of this brashly murderous plot, right? So let me read to you chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Here's what it says in the New Living Translation. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all of the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down to Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or to show him respect. Did you catch it? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? How could you not find this word that sticks out like this sore thumb in these two verses? Maybe it wasn't as obvious as it was to the original readers, right? The original listeners to the story, the original readers of this story would have noticed this instantly, right? And the word that we're looking for is Agagite. Not one that brings much to the forefront of your mind, I'm assuming, right? Unless you're some ancient Hebrew scholar. But it's one word that would have instantly brought forth images for the Jews because it comes from the name Agag, who was the leader of the Amalekites, who were one of the ancient foes of the Hebrew people. Amalek was the grandson of Esau, who was brother to Jacob, right? Who had given up his inheritance for a bowl of soup. And these two brothers, right, in their constant rivalry, continued to hate each other. And it was passed down to their children and their grandchildren as these two nations were in an almost constant war, to the point that in 1 Samuel, God commands that the Amalekites be utterly destroyed by Saul, who fails to carry out this genocide, which then loses him his divine right to rule the Hebrew people. Now, this is just, it's kind of hard for us to grasp, right? Because we don't know the Hebrew history well enough for this really to sink in. So let me help you understand it like this. See if this sounds a little bit different and maybe bring something else to your mind as I'm reading it. Sometime later, same verses in chapter 3, sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Nazi, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or to show him respect. Helpful? That spark a little bit something different in your mind? Haman came from a long line of people who had hated the Jews with a passion. And when he worked his way up to the place of power, he was finally able to use that power. His personal beliefs, his character, his morals weren't really as big of a deal while he was just a noble. But once this Nazi became a powerful, the most powerful noble in all of the empire, it quickly became a problem. So when he heard that Mordecai, this Jew, wouldn't bow down to him, it wasn't just that he wouldn't bow down to him. It was that he was a Jew. He knew that he had the primer that he had been looking for this righteous war, right? So he gathered some conspirators and they rolled some dice, right? Called Pur, or when there's more than one of them, Purim. So they rolled these dice to see when would be a good day for some good old-fashioned killing. And the dice came up with March 7th, almost a year later. And Haman the Nazi went to work getting the plan ready. He went and he spoke to the king and he convinced them that these people were going to be a problem. Not just for Haman personally, because the king probably didn't really care about what Haman's issues were. But these people were going to be a problem for the king. They didn't have the same customs as all the rest of the Persians. They had their own laws. They had their own diets and everything else. And they were just kind of odd. They weren't assimilating. And at some point, they were going to be an issue. So Haman offers to make a contribution to the royal treasury in order to help fund what obviously needed to be done with these people, right? And when somebody offers you 375 tons of silver, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to take them up on that offer. I mean, at today's current price of silver, that's around $127.5 million in cash. So the king agrees, and the plan is set up and put into motion. And chapter 3 concludes with Haman and Xerxes sitting down to drink in the royal palace while the city of Susa falls into confusion at this new decree that the king has just signed into law. The terms of this new decree not only spelled out the deaths of all Jews in the entire empire of Persia, which would have included Jerusalem at that time, but it also called upon the Persian people to do the killing themselves. And as a reward for their help in this day of butchery, the Persian people could keep everything from any of the Jews that they had personally killed, right? They could keep their jewelry, their gold, their silver, even their homes and their land. And as you can imagine, Mordecai loses it when he hears of this royal decree. And Queen Esther's maids and her servants, they come to tell her about her cousin who had apparently gone into this deep depression, this time of mourning. But he didn't really tell her why. And so through a couple of messages that are passed back and forth between Esther and Mordecai, like, a couple of kids in junior high English class, Mordecai pleads with Esther to go and beg the king to take back this decree, like rescind it. The problem is Esther hasn't seen the king in a month. And walking into the king's royal presence without being requested, it could mean immediate death. And this is where we have one of the most powerful moments in the entire story of Esther. The line that makes this entire story worth reading. Mordecai sends Esther this note after she tells him that, look, she hasn't seen the king for a month and she could be executed for even trying to speak with him without him requesting her presence. Chapter 4, verse 13, we get to read these notes. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Esther, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace that you're going to escape when all of the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather all of the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, even though it's against the law, I will go in and see the king. If I have to die, I have to die. And so Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. And there it is. These two notes that were written 2,500 years ago, and yet they're still remembered today. They still carry the emotional weight and the intensity and the heroism and the bravery that they did so many millennia ago. This idea that Mordecai puts forth, that maybe, just maybe, God has placed each of us right where we are on purpose, in the middle of exactly what we've been called to be part of. That we have what we have, our influence, our money, our talents, our skills, not just for our own use and our own pleasure, but to be used for something greater than ourselves. Something that isn't just chance or random luck, but something that God is doing that will make a world of difference to the people in our lives. That will make the world a better place, and we get to play a part in that. And so Esther begins to plan exactly how to use her influence to save all of the Jewish people around the world. And if you know the story, you know that she walks into the king's presence, right? Despite the very real possibility of being beheaded on the spot. And she invites her husband, King Xerxes, and Haman, the Nazi, to a banquet that she's prepared for them that evening. And the king is stoked, right? I mean, he's excited. He sends his attendants to go get Haman, the Nazi, so that they can go to this banquet that Queen Esther is throwing for the two of them. Now, remember, nobody in the palace knows that Esther is a Jew at this point. Xerxes and Haman have no clue that she's Jewish. And when Haman hears that he's been invited to this private royal banquet with the king and the queen, he is stoked. I mean, he's just beyond himself. I mean, how incredible is it that the queen has invited him and only him to a private banquet that he gets to have with the king? He knew this was going to be a really good week for him, right? And during the banquet, the queen invites both of them to another banquet that'll take place the next evening, 2 in a row. Could this get any better for this guy? I mean, he is just rising up in the ranks and he's stoked. But on his way out of the palace, he passes by Mordecai, who's guarding the gates. And again, Mordecai refuses to show him the level of respect that he deserves. And Haman is just boiling with rage. I mean, he just hates this guy. So when he gets home and he tells his wife of all of this great news that's been happening, this banquet he's just been to and this next one that he gets to go to, and he invites his closest friends over to fill them in on all the good news, maybe a little bit of boasting and bragging, but he also vents to them about this freaking Jew, Mordecai. God, I just can't wait until all these guys are dead, right? And so Haman's wife comes up with this great idea, very Nazi of her. Here's verse 14. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all of his friends suggested, hey, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall. And in the morning, go and ask the king to impale Mordecai on it, right? And when this is done, you can go on with your merry way and head to the banquet with the king. And this pleased Haman, the Nazi, and so he orders the pole to be set up. Well, that night, Xerxes can't sleep. So he calls in his attendant to read to him from the royal book of history, right? I mean, nothing like hearing your own life story to put you asleep. Well, the attendant just happens to open up this story to the page that tells of how Mordecai, the Jew, saved the king's life by uncovering this assassination plot to kill him, right? Well, the king had totally forgotten about this entire thing with everything that's been going on. And so he asks, hey, what did we ever do to pay back Mordecai? I mean, this guy's a hero. Did we do anything for him? That attendant's like, no, we never really did. So the king is like, shoot, calls in Haman that morning. He says, hey, Haman, what should I do for somebody that I want to honor? Right? What should I do? Here's verse 6 of chapter 6. So Haman came in and the king said, you know, what do I want? What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? And Haman thought to himself, man, who else would the king wish to honor more than me? Obviously. So he replied, man, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden on, and one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man who the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's royal robes and led through the city square on the king's own horse, and have the official shout as they go, 'This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor.'" "Excellent idea," says the king to Haman. "Quick, Haman, take the robes and my horse and do exactly as you have just said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing that you've suggested." Can you even imagine how livid Haman the Nazi would have been at this moment? He spent the entire day leading Mordecai around on the king's horse, proclaiming the king's honor and appreciation for Mordecai the Jew. But at least he had the queen's banquet to look forward to that night, right? That banquet's going to have to wait until next week when we close out this series, and it's quite the doozy. But for now, I want to leave you with this thought. What has God brought you through in your past? What has God been preparing you for? Have you been paying attention and preparing yourself for what God has in store for your future? Oftentimes, as a pastor, as I listen to people's life stories, right? Stories of their pain and their heartache, their trauma and their loss, it's hard, even for me as a pastor, to see how God has been working through these moments and these seasons in their lives. Like Esther, who lost her parents at an early age and was then taken away from her adoptive family. It's hard to see how it's even possible for God to be working in any of that garbage. But what if God hasn't been absent in those moments? Those moments that have brought you to this place in your life? What if those moments actually help to prepare you, just like they did for Esther, for your part that God needs you to play in God's story? What if you, just like Esther, get to choose how you respond to those moments that can change the lives of the people that you've been surrounded by? Like I said at the start of this message, I'm not a young girl destined to be queen of Persia, but I do believe that I have a role to play in God's story. I know that God has placed me where I am. And who knows if perhaps I was made for such a time as this. So where has God placed you? What influence have you been given? What skills do you have? What resources? Who's been placed around you right now? I know that especially right now, it's hard to see beyond the moment and to focus on more than just survival mode, right? With everything that's going on, I get it. But I believe that God is doing and planning more than just our day-to-day existence right now. I believe that we've been called, just as Esther was, to use everything that God has given us to save the people around us and to give them the life that God desires for them. Our job is to figure out how to do that, and then to let God take care of the rest. And so this week, may you go out into the world that God has placed you in, to use the influence and the resources and the skills to speak into and to change the lives for the better for those people that God has placed around you, both practically, spiritually, and eternally. And may God go with you as you do.